On a stormy midnight in downtown Crescent, a piercing voice shattered the relentless drumming of rain against the pavement. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's calm query contrasted sharply with the fury that followed on the line. There's a suspicious truck parked illegally right outside my apartment building, and I demand it be towed away immediately. Karen's voice rang out, high-pitched and resolute, as she declared that the ominous vehicle was nothing short of a criminal hideout. Hidden behind a veil of darkness in a nondescript surveillance van, Agent Daniel Carter leaned back in his seat, rubbing his temple as he listened to Karen's impassioned tirade crackling through his earpiece. Through a discreet live feed, Carter observed the scene, a sleek black truck, ominously stationed beneath a flickering neon sign and illuminated sporadically by lightning, bristled with high-tech monitoring equipment, microphones, encrypted laptops, and other surveillance devices. Unbeknownst to Karen, this mobile command center was part of an undercover FBI operation tracking a dangerous arms smuggler lurking just 3 buildings away. Outside, Karen, a middle-aged force of nature armed with a clipboard in one hand and a smartphone in the other, stormed down the rain-slicked sidewalk like a vigilante determined to uphold her personal brand of order. With the unwavering confidence of someone who believed her self-modified HOA rules were gospel, she scrutinized the truck as if piecing together clues at a high-stakes crime scene. No visible permit, no resident sticker. This vehicle doesn't belong here, she proclaimed, convinced that its mere presence endangered the sanctity of her meticulously curated environment, even though it violated no actual law. According to the dog-eared pages of her handwritten rulebook, a version of the HOA handbook she'd tailored to her own uncompromising standards, no vehicle was allowed to be parked on the street overnight, a regulation that, though unofficial, she enforced with an intensity bordering on fanaticism. Planting her hands firmly on her hips, Karen narrowed her eyes at the truck's impenetrable tinted windows and hissed, "Oh, you want to play games, do you?" In one swift, dramatic motion, she flipped open her ticket book and began furiously scribbling out a violation notice in bold, aggressive strokes. Carter watched the spectacle with a mix of mild amusement and exasperation. He had encountered international spies, drug lords, and hardened criminals, but Karen's relentless interference was a whole new kind of challenge. The covert FBI surveillance hinged on the stealth of this operation, and her meddling was rapidly turning a controlled stakeout into an unpredictable farce. The moment Karen's fervent call reached the dispatcher, the local police flagged the truck's license plate, instantly recognizing its federal clearance. Yet Karen, undeterred by any semblance of logic, refused to yield. When a sudden gust of wind whisked her meticulously penned violation off the windshield, she retrieved a roll of bright red duct tape from her bag, an item she always carried for such emergencies, and slapped the notice back onto the truck with unyielding force, as though her determination alone could make the vehicle vanish. Standing with her arms crossed, she surveyed her handiwork, waiting for a reaction, but the truck remained inert and no one emerged from its shadowy interior. Fueled by mounting paranoia, Karen stormed back toward her building, her clipboard clutched like a weapon, and redialed 911 with a fiercer urgency. "I'm calling again. There's someone inside that truck. They're ignoring me. This is highly suspicious." Her frantic insistence echoed through the line as the dispatcher, aware of the vehicle's federal ties, attempted to placate her. "Ma'am, is the truck obstructing your entrance or violating any city ordinances?" they asked gently. "It's breaking my rules," she snapped, her crusade for order intensifying with every second. Back in the surveillance van, Agent Carter exhaled slowly, bracing himself for another round of Karen's relentless interference. In that charged, rain-drenched night, amid the clash of thunder and unwavering defiance, Karen's obsessive pursuit of control was about to collide head-on with a covert federal operation. The collision destined to shake the very foundations of her self-opinioned authority. Agent Carter's irritation simmered like a pot on the verge of boiling over. Karen's incessant calls and defiant attitude had transformed what was initially an amusing distraction into a full-blown headache. As her voice echoed through his earpiece and the live feed showed her impending attempt to break federal protocol, Carter realized that things were about to spiral into a much bigger mess. If Karen continued her relentless pursuit, local law enforcement might be forced by volume and sheer force of her will to dispatch an officer, and that could lead to delays, unnecessary questions, and in the worst case, jeopardize the operation. He needed to act quickly and sideline her without alerting the situation to the authorities. With practiced speed, Carter pulled out his phone and quickly typed out a secure, coded message to his partner, who had been stationed undercover on a nearby side street. The moment he hit send, the reply came almost immediately. "Hold position. We'll handle it if it escalates." The FBI had been patiently waiting in the shadows while Karen made her costly racket. Their stakeout carefully monitored an international arms ring, and she, with all of her pomp and insufferable obstinance, had no idea that every step she took was threatening to blow it wide open. Inside the truck, Carter leaned back, rubbed his eyes in frustration, and continued watching the unfolding chaos. As Karen paraded around the black vehicle for a second time, inspecting it like a ruthless overseer, he could hear the slight din of her voice escalating through the built-in mics of the truck. Whether or not she realized it, she wasn't dealing with a mere parking violation, but a federal investigation that her fixation had now dangerously compromised. When she re-entered her home, Carter let out a shallow breath, thinking the madness might pause for a moment, but then, as if to mock all reason, Karen reappeared at her door with a new resolve and a weapon in hand, her secret weapon, the local tow truck's business card. Carter's stomach churned. She had just escalated her tantrum to unprecedented levels. He was about to see whether or not she would tie her greatest mistake to an even bigger betrayal. As he stared at the screen through the surveillance van, the absurdity of the situation became painfully clear. Karen might be irritating, irrational, and blindingly self-righteous, but Carter knew she could also be unwittingly dangerous when operating with such wild conviction. And now she had decided to drag an independent tow service into the fray, unleashing unnecessary attention to the already volatile situation. His gut screamed at him to act, to intercede immediately before she forced the cop's hand or put the investigation in grave danger. But something, the gleam in her eyes, the relentless pacing, the assuredness with which she clutched her phone, kept him in his seat. Carter wasn't sure why, but the moment felt surreal. The impending disaster wasn't just some result of bureaucratic oversight. No, this was shaping up to be something that was almost entertaining. "Carter, are you seeing this?" came a voice crackling in his ear. It was his partner, watching her antics from his own observation point. "Oh, I'm seeing it," Carter sighed, his annoyance starting to bleed with begrudging admiration. "She's on a warpath now. Let's see how far this goes." His partner chuckled knowingly. "You think we should shut it down?" "Not yet," Carter muttered. "Let her dig her own grave a bit deeper." "Some people," Carter added, leaning towards the monitor as Karen scrolled anxiously through her phone, waiting for the imaginary gold standard of authority the tow truck represented, "are their own worst enemy." He could feel the absurdity of the situation weighing on him now more than ever. Karen's posturing was about to snowball into something far worse than a simple drive-by nuisance, and deep down, Carter knew that the moment she activated the tow truck ruse, everything would come crashing down on her. For 36 seconds, now the situation was spiraling fast, and Agent Carter realized just how out of control it had become. Karen, oblivious to the ongoing FBI investigation, was operating on sheer determination, convinced she could single-handedly solve the problem. He could see that her persistence was eating up his time, and her judgment was getting more reckless by the minute. As she posted updates of her own, Carter's earpiece buzzed with a quick exchange. His partner agreed. Let Karen take the lead. Let her make the mistake. "Don't care, send someone now, or do I have to go down to the station myself?" Karen snapped, her voice sharp and definite. Agent Carter, blinking in disbelief, realized the situation had gone from mildly amusing to incredibly frustrating. If she made enough noise, an officer might arrive, and that could expose the operation. He needed to stop her from making a bigger mess. Meanwhile, Karen's husband offered some weak attempt at reasoning, suggesting the truck was just a delivery driver. But Karen was way past listening. The moment she called for a tow truck, Carter's frustration peaked. Agent Carter quickly pulled out his phone and sent a quick coded message to his partner nearby, hoping to keep things under control. The response was almost immediate. "Hold position, we'll handle it if it escalates." Meanwhile, Karen, staring out the window at the truck, didn't seem to realize the consequences of her actions. Her husband Greg, trying to defuse the situation, suggested it could just be a delivery driver on a break, but Karen was having none of it. "Don't be ridiculous, Greg," she snapped. "No delivery driver sits around all day. This is criminal. A drug van, a spy, a tax fraud, who knows?" Greg sighed. "Or maybe it's none of your business." Karen gasped as if struck, staring at her husband in wide-eyed disbelief before launching into her own unshakable rationale. "None of my business. Greg, I am the HOA enforcer. We're not even on the board because those cowards won't do their jobs. Someone has to take control." Without waiting for Greg to argue further, Karen stormed out of the house. Inside the surveillance truck, Carter watched with mild amusement as Karen approached, muttering angrily under her breath, "Fine. If the cops won't deal with it, I'll get a tow truck." As she walked, Karen produced her second weapon, a private tow truck's business card. Carter groaned aloud. This was taking a turn for the worse. He debated whether to step out and reveal his badge, but something told him to hold back. Maybe this would get interesting. So he waited. Karen continued to pace in front of the truck, her phone clutched tightly in her hands as she checked for updates from the tow company. She didn't know that every move she made was unraveling the very operation she had no clue existed. Unbeknownst to her, this was not just any surveillance truck, it was part of a high-stakes FBI operation tracking down an international arms smuggling ring. Karen was unknowingly sabotaging a federal sting and distracting agents all the while. "Don't care to send someone now, or do I have to march down to the station myself?" Karen's shrill command rang out through the receiver, cutting through the clamor of the storm outside. Back in the surveillance van, Agent Carter grimaced as he realized that what had once been an amusing quirk in an otherwise routine operation was rapidly evolving into a dangerous liability. Every minute Karen continued her tirade increased the risk of drawing unwanted attention that might lead to an officer being dispatched, triggering a chain reaction of delays and probing questions that could expose their covert FBI operation. With a resigned sigh, Carter fumbled for his phone and punched in a series of coded instructions to his partner stationed in an unmarked car just down the rain-slicked street. Almost immediately a terse reply came through, "Hold position. If it escalates, we'll handle it." At that very moment, Karen was fixated at her apartment window, her eyes locked on the ominous black truck parked defiantly beneath a flickering street lamp. It was as though she believed sheer will could make it vanish. From the next building, her husband Greg, a reserved man long accustomed to her dramatic outbursts, peered over his shoulder in an attempt to interject a note of reason. "Maybe it's just a delivery driver on break," he offered softly, hoping to diffuse the tension. Karen's response was instantaneous and scathing. "Oh, don't be ridiculous, Greg. No delivery driver would sit in one place for an entire day. This is clearly criminal activity. It could be a drug van, a spy's mobile lair, or even a front for tax fraud." Her words cut through the murmurs of the storm, as if the very elements were echoing her conviction. Greg hesitated before murmuring, "Or maybe it's just none of your business." The rebuke hit her like a slap, and with an indignant gasp, Karen retorted, "None of my business, Greg. This is my duty as an HOA enforcer. We're not even on the highway board because some cowards wouldn't do what's necessary. Someone has to keep this neighborhood in order." Before Greg could protest further, Karen stormed out of the building, her clipboard clutched tightly as if it were a scepter of justice. Carter watched her from the van, her determined march punctuating the darkness as she muttered under her breath, "If the cops won't do their job, I'll get this thing towed myself." In a moment that epitomized her relentless drive, she whipped out a private tow truck company's business card, her so-called third and final weapon in the battle against the criminal truck. From inside the van, Carter couldn't help but groan. Karen had now escalated her crusade by summoning a tow truck, a move that threatened to turn a covert federal operation into a public farce. For a long, tense minute, Carter debated whether to intervene directly by stepping out and flashing his badge, but an inexplicable hunch that this unfolding drama was destined to be both catastrophic and, dare he admit, entertaining, kept him in his seat. Instead, he watched as Karen paced back and forth, her phone pressed hard against her ear while she anxiously awaited news of the tow truck's arrival. Unbeknownst to her, every step she took and every call she made was unwittingly jeopardizing an intricate FBI sting operation targeting an international arms smuggling ring. In her single-minded determination, Karen was about to blow the entire operation wide open. Her eyes never left the truck. She paced in front of it like a caged animal, her grip on the phone white-knuckled and her clipboard now a sacred artifact, its page for suspicious vehicles underlined not once but 3 times for emphasis. Inside the truck, hidden cameras captured every moment of her fervent vigilante act. Agent Carter, who had encountered cartel leaders, international spies, and hardened criminals, was now marveling, albeit with a tinge of exasperation, at the sheer audacity of this woman. Then, his earpiece crackled to life with a familiar voice from his partner. "Carter, you seeing this? Karen's on a warpath." Carter exhaled slowly as he replied, "Not yet. Let's see how far she takes it." He knew all too well that sometimes the greatest threat wasn't the enemy lurking in the shadows, but the self-sabotage of those who believed they alone could enforce their own version of justice. And tonight, Karen's crusade was spiraling dangerously close to disaster. The storm outside was still raging when Karen's impatience reached a fever pitch. The tow truck's delay was unacceptable to her, and she wasn't about to sit idly by while her meticulously maintained neighborhood was threatened by what she saw as blatant lawlessness. With her determination undimmed by the dark and rain, Karen grabbed her coat and marched down the hall of her apartment building, her clipboard clutched tightly in one hand like a badge of authority. Her next stop was the home of her neighbor Deborah. a kindred spirit in her crusade for neighborhood order. Reaching Deborah's door, Karen pounded the doorbell in rapid succession, 5 firm, insistent knocks, echoing through the corridor. Moments later, Deborah herself opened the door, still wrapped in a soft bathrobe and balancing a steaming cup of chamomile tea. "Deborah, listen, I'm telling you, we have a serious threat right here," Karen exclaimed, her finger jabbing emphatically toward the ominous black truck parked in the distance, its dark silhouette illuminated intermittently by flashes of lightning. "There's an illegal vehicle in our community, and it's been parked here for over 24 hours. This is not normal. It's a menace." Deborah's eyes widened in disbelief, nearly causing her to spill her tea as she stammered, "Oh my heavens, Karen?" The exclamation, though soft, was enough to confirm Karen's suspicions. Finally, someone understood. "I've already called the tow truck," Karen continued, her voice rising with fervor, "but I need backup. We must ensure that this never happens again." Within minutes, Karen's rallying cry had attracted a small mob of self-appointed neighborhood enforcers, fellow residents who shared her rigid views on community order. They assembled along the rain-slicked sidewalk, murmuring about how outsiders were corrupting their pristine haven. An elderly man squinted at the truck, remarking, "It looks like a government vehicle," to which Karen scoffed indignantly. "Oh, please. If it were a government vehicle, it'd have a proper logo. This is the work of someone who thinks they're above our rules." Inside the surveillance van, Agent Carter couldn't help but chuckle softly. If only Karen knew that her self-righteous vigilance was about to interfere catastrophically with an ongoing FBI operation. Fueled by her sense of duty and heroism, Karen refused to simply wait for the tow truck any longer. Taking a deep, determined breath, she marched out from her front door, clipboard raised high as if it were a scepter of justice. Flanked by her newly gathered band of HOA enforcers, she strode directly toward the black truck. Arriving at its cold, unyielding side, she began pounding on the window once, twice, 3 times, her voice echoing in the night as she bellowed, "You can't just sit there. You're in violation of our HOA rules." The truck's response was a heavy, impenetrable silence that only fueled her anger. Without hesitating, Karen made a critical error. She reached for the driver's door handle, determined to force an answer. At that moment, Agent Carter's instincts kicked into high gear. Hidden inside the van, he tensed. The truck was rigged with sensitive FBI surveillance equipment, and any breach could jeopardize a major federal sting targeting an international arms smuggling ring. His hand hovered near his weapon, ready to intervene the moment Karen's actions went too far. Yet, as she pulled, the door stubbornly refused to budge, locked tight. Frustrated, Karen yanked again, muttering, "It's locked. This proves he's hiding something." Her exclamation barely registered before she pulled out her phone once more, dialing 911 for a 3rd time. 911, what's your emergency?" The dispatcher's voice crackled on the line. "I already called earlier about the illegally parked truck," Karen snapped. "I just tried talking to the driver and he wouldn't even acknowledge me. He's hiding inside, behaving suspiciously. Probably a criminal. I want him arrested." Inside the van, Agent Carter closed his eyes and exhaled sharply. On the other end, the dispatcher tried to reason with her. "Ma'am, the vehicle is legally parked. If the driver is inside and hasn't threatened you, there's no crime here." But Karen would not be dissuaded. "This is my neighborhood." "I will not be ignored," she insisted, her voice rising to a near shout. "Then I wanted to be told immediately." The dispatcher hesitated, explaining that towing requests were a private matter, but Karen was relentless. Moments later, Carter's radio crackled with news. "Local PD just got a report from dispatch. They're sending a unit to handle an aggressive trespasser." With a resigned sigh, Agent Carter realized it was time to put an end to this farce. The night was about to take an even more dramatic turn as the tow truck finally arrived, and with it, the full force of the FBI. The rain-soaked street pulsed with tension as Karen's furious declaration cut through the downpour. "This is a blatant violation of our HOA rules, and I want that vehicle removed immediately," she shrieked, her voice echoing off the wet pavement. The tow truck driver, busy at work hooking up the ominous black truck, paused and scratched his head. Lady, I just move cars. I don't enforce HOA rules, just do it," he mumbled, shrugging as if her outburst were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. From the shelter of his surveillance van, Agent Carter's patience had worn dangerously thin. He muttered under his breath, "Enough's enough," and with a determined heft he reached for his badge and gun. Cracking his knuckles in a silent warning, he strode out into the storm. The moment his boot hit the rain-lashed pavement, everything shifted. With his voice low and resolute, he barked, "Ma'am, step away from the vehicle." Instantly, Karen froze mid-stride, her eyes wide with disbelief and indignation. The tow truck driver recoiled, and the small cluster of HOA enforcers gathered nearby gasped in unison. In one swift motion, Carter pulled out his FBI badge and held it high. "This vehicle," he declared, his tone unyielding, "is part of an active federal surveillance operation. You've just compromised a critical investigation." Karen's face blanched, her bravado crumbling into shock. "What? What did you just say?" she stammered, barely comprehending the gravity of the situation. Carter's sigh was heavy with finality as he stated, "You just called 911 on an FBI stakeout." Before anyone could process his words, the thunderous roar of black SUVs tore through the night. Sirens blared as doors slammed open and armed FBI agents spilled onto the street, their presence a stark contrast to the chaotic energy moments before. Neighbors peered nervously from behind drawn curtains and stepped onto their porches, whispering in shock at the unfolding spectacle. The atmosphere, once charged with Karen's self-assured determination, now quivered with imminent federal authority. Stunned into silence, Karen watched as the tow truck driver, who had been so nonchalantly connecting his equipment, now froze mid-motion, his hands trembling. Agent Carter stepped forward, exuding the calm control of a seasoned professional who had encountered far more dangerous adversaries than an overzealous HOA enforcer. "Step away from the vehicle, ma'am," he repeated, his voice firm and unyielding. Realizing the seriousness of his error, the tow truck driver quickly raised his hands in surrender. I didn't know, ma'am. I just got a call. I don't want any trouble," he stuttered, his voice almost lost amid the storm. Carter offered a brief nod. "Relax. You were just following orders." "But you're not towing anything today," he assured, prompting the driver to unhook his chains as swiftly as possible. Karenology was struggling to grasp the unfolding disaster. Her mind raced as the reality of her actions sank in. She had attempted to forcibly remove a vehicle integral to a federal investigation. This is ridiculous," she managed, her voice quivering as she waved a shaky hand toward Carter. "You should have identified yourself earlier," she demanded, desperation mingling with anger. A nearby agent scoffed, remarking coolly, "Ma'am, we don't exactly put up FBI surveillance signs on our vehicles." Ignoring the remark, Karen turned back to Carter, her face flushed with a mix of fury and humiliation. "This is your fault. You've been here for over a day, and we have rules in this community," she insisted, her tone rising in a futile attempt to regain control. Carter exhaled slowly and tilted his head, letting the silence of the rainy night underscore his next words. He motioned toward one of his armed colleagues and said, "Lady, you just interfered with a federal investigation." The impact of his statement struck Karen like a sledgehammer. Her clipboard slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the wet pavement. One by one, the self-appointed HOA enforcers began to back away, their expressions shifting from fierce loyalty to apprehension, unwilling to be dragged into a federal debacle. Carter's eyes narrowed as he fixed his gaze on Karen. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" he demanded softly, the weight of his words hanging heavily in the charged silence. For a long, painful moment, Karen could only stand there, dumbfounded, as the storm swallowed the remnants of her once commanding authority. Karen's mouth finally fell silent as the gravity of the situation sank in. Agent Carter stepped closer, his tone low and unwavering as he addressed her. "While you were busy making a spectacle of yourself, the actual suspect we were monitoring slipped away." His words cut through the rain and the murmurs of the gathered neighbors. Karen's face twisted with a mix of shock and regret as she swallowed hard, her bravado deflating under the weight of Carter's accusation. "A suspect?" she stammered, but Carter's reply was blunt and final. "This isn't a safe neighborhood anymore. Thanks to your little tantrum, we've just lost a key lead." The impact of his words left Karen trembling, her lip quivering as the murmurs of discontent rose among the onlookers. Carter shook his head slowly, his gaze piercing as he continued, "You really think slapping fake HOA violations on cars makes you powerful? Let me explain something. Federal law always trumps HOA rules." Karen sputtered in disbelief. I was just interfering with an active surveillance operation," but one of the agents, arms folded and tone icy, interjected, "Do you realize that's a felony?" The weight of his words sent a fresh wave of terror through her, and another agent nodded solemnly, "Obstruction of justice, interfering with federal operations. We could even press charges for reckless endangerment." By this time, Karen was visibly shaking, her earlier confidence crumbling in the harsh reality of the moment. Greg, her husband, who had been standing quietly on their porch until now, finally stepped forward, his voice cautious as he addressed the agents. Agents, my wife is just very passionate about the HCOA. She didn't mean any harm, she just..." His words faltered as Carter's eyes locked onto him with steely intensity. Passionate, she made 3 separate calls to 911, tried to tow a federal vehicle, and caused enough commotion that an armed suspect is now out of our reach, Carter stated evenly. He paused, allowing the silence to emphasize his next words. That sounds like harm to me. Karen's eyes widened in panic as she looked to Greg, silently pleading for him to intervene. Say something. Help me, she managed. But Greg hesitated before turning back to Carter with a measured tone. How much trouble is she actually in? His question hung in the damp air, heavy with implication. Karen's jaw dropped at the possibility, and a long, painful silence stretched between them. Finally, Carter exhaled deeply. Technically, if I wanted to press charges, you could be looking at some very serious legal consequences. His words elicited a horrified squeak from Karen, and even the neighbors gasped audibly at the unfolding drama. Still, Carter's expression remained unyielding. I've better things to do than spend the next few weeks dealing with an HOA nuisance, he declared, his tone final. The tension in the rain-soaked street seemed to momentarily ease, and Karen visibly relaxed, as if a burden had been lifted, until Carter's smirk deepened. I'm letting you off with a warning, he said, then paused for emphasis, but if I hear about you calling 911 over yet another bit of HOA drama, I will file charges next time. Karen forced a nervous laugh. Oh, I wouldn't dream of it. Carter then stepped back, his gaze sweeping over the stunned neighborhood as if sealing the moment. Good, then we're done here, he announced. At that precise moment, the FBI agents began swiftly packing up. The tow truck driver, eager to escape the chaos, peeled out of the street in record time. Karen stood there, shell-shocked, while Greg patted her shoulder in a feeble attempt at consolation. Well, that was embarrassing, he murmured. Though Karen shot him a glare instead of an apology, for the first time in years, the formidable Karen, self-appointed ruler of her community, was truly humbled. As the fleet of FBI SUVs roared away, leaving behind a quiet, stunned neighborhood, it became painfully clear that Karen had irrevocably lost her grip on the HOA. The meticulously ordered world she had built, where her word was law and her fabricated rules reigned supreme, had come crashing down in spectacular fashion. Her clipboard, once a symbol of her authority, lay abandoned on the pavement, a stark reminder of the false power she had wielded. In that dismal, rain-soaked silence, Karen could only stand and watch as her reign unraveled, marking the beginning of a very public and irrevocable downfall. Even as the last of the FBI SUVs disappeared into the distance, the gathered neighbors began to murmur among themselves. Their stares were a mix of thinly veiled amusement and barely contained disbelief as they took in the scene before them. Karen, once so commanding and self-assured, now standing defiant yet utterly exposed. Though her power had crumbled under the weight of actual federal authority, Karen refused to accept defeat without a fight. With a determined, if shaky, breath, she straightened her posture, cleared her throat, and turned to address the small, restless crowd that had gathered near the abandoned clipboard and scattered remnants of her once feared HOV violations. Well, that was certainly unexpected, she declared, forcing a semblance of dignity into her tone. I was only doing my civic duty. Greg, who had watched the entire debacle unfold with a mix of exasperation and pity, pinched the bridge of his nose and muttered, Karen don't. But she pressed on, her voice rising as she tried to salvage her reputation. How was I supposed to know that truck belonged to the, government? She stuttered, her words tumbling out in a desperate attempt at explanation. A skeptical neighbor interjected with a scoff. You called 911 3 times? Did you really think the FBI just drives around in trucks emblazoned with federal surveillance? Ignoring the jibe, Karen continued, The important thing is that we now know there was a dangerous suspect living in our neighborhood. And yes, I was the one who forced the FBI to take action. If it weren't for me, they might not have moved fast enough. Greg's sigh of resignation filled the heavy air as he stepped forward, trying to reason with her. Karen, you didn't force the FBI to do anything. You just got in the way of an active investigation. You almost got yourself arrested. But Karen waved him off, determined to cling to her narrative despite its glaring flaws. As a few neighbors shook their heads and began to drift away, disinterested in her self-serving theatrics, one man, Tom, stepped forward. Having endured Karen's overbearing antics one too many times, he crossed his arms and said sharply, So let me get this straight. You expect us to believe you helped the FBI, even after they told you that you made the suspect get away? Karen sputtered, her face reddening with indignation and confusion. I mean, maybe the suspect was going to escape anyway. Perhaps I was just the catalyst for a necessary course correction. Tom's eyebrow arched, incredulously. A catalyst? Lady, you were the problem, he shot back. and his remark was met with a ripple of laughter from the remaining onlookers. Desperation mounting, Karen's jaw clenched as she tried to rewrite the narrative. After all these years, she had ruled the HOA with an iron fist, but now her reputation lay in ruins. If she didn't act quickly, she would lose every shred of authority she'd so ruthlessly maintained. Raising her voice in one last bid to reclaim control, Karen proclaimed, "Listen, let's not get bogged down in the details. The fact remains, our neighborhood has become a target for crime. If we had a stronger HOA with better enforcement, none of this would have happened." Greg groaned. In the background, "Karen, stop. You're embarrassing yourself." But she was too deep in her delusions to heed his words. "No, Greg," she insisted fiercely. "We need stricter parking regulations. If the FBI is out here investigating criminals, it means more outsiders are sneaking into our community. We have to be proactive." At this, Tom couldn't help but laugh out loud. "Unbelievable," he scoffed, drawing more mocking laughter from the crowd. Karen, undeterred, continued, pointing an accusing finger into the cool night air. "I say we petition the city for stronger parking enforcement, maybe even establish an official HOA security force. Clearly, we can't rely on the government to protect us." A woman in the crowd wiped tears from her eyes as someone remarked, "Oh, Karen, you really think the city's going to listen to you after this?" Flushing a deep shade of crimson, she snapped back, "They should. I'm only trying to keep us safe." Tom smirked darkly. "Safe from yourself, maybe." And the laughter that followed seemed to seal her fate. In that rain-soaked, disillusioned moment, Karen's final grasp on power evaporated before the very eyes of her neighbors. Her reign reduced to a pitiful echo of delusions and desperate proclamations in the face of undeniable federal authority. As the echoes of Agent Carter's stern warning faded into the damp night, Karen's impassioned pleas fell on deaf ears. Her once loyal supporters, those self-appointed enforcers of her draconian HOA rules, began to disperse one by one. "Don't take action. We'll all regret it," someone had murmured in vain, but now even the most dedicated among them were abandoning her cause. Deborah, who had long stood by Karen's side as the neighborhood's second-in-command, avoided meeting her eyes as she quietly turned and headed home. In that moment, Karen felt a crushing pit form in her stomach. She had lost, and worse, she knew it. Just when Karen thought the calamity couldn't worsen, fate delivered a final humiliating blow. One of the FBI agents, who had lingered in the background after the dramatic showdown, strode purposefully toward her with a knowing smirk. With a deliberate flip of a worn city code violation book, he addressed her coolly, "Ma'am." His tone was laced with quiet amusement as he pointed toward her own property. Karen's eyes widened in disbelief when the agent explained, "It turns out your fence is 3 inches over the city's legal height limit. That's a code violation. You have 48 hours to fix it before fines start piling up." "But what?" Karen stammered, her voice barely a whisper as the realization struck her like a cold slap. The agent merely smiled and shrugged, as if such bureaucratic minutiae were of little consequence compared to her previous theatrics. "City rules be echo rules every single time," he quipped lightly, leaving Karen reeling. In that charged moment, Greg, her husband, burst into laughter, the sound echoing through the rain-soaked night. "Oh, this is the best day of my life," he managed between chuckles. Karen whipped around, fury and humiliation battling on her flushed face. "Greg, this is not funny," she snapped, her voice trembling with a mix of rage and despair. Greg, ever the reluctant mediator, wiped a tear from his eye and simply replied, "It's a little funny, Karen." Nearby, Tom, another neighbor who had long been weary of her domineering ways, leaned casually against a mailbox, his smirk widening as he interjected, "So let me get this straight. After all the commotion, the only violation you actually got was on your own property." His words, delivered with a hint of derision, stung sharply. For a long silent moment, Karen stood there, shaking with rage and disbelief. Her mouth opened to protest, but no words came. She had been utterly defeated. The FBI was long gone, her neighbors had turned their backs on her, and now she faced the bitter irony of a legal violation on her very own doorstep. It was as if the universe had served her a brutal poetic dose of karma, a reckoning for years of overbearing control and false authority. Unable to bear the crushing weight of her humiliation, Karen stormed back into her house, slamming the door shut behind her. Her face, a mask of red humiliation mixed with rage and utter disbelief, betrayed the collapse of the self-proclaimed Queen of the HOA. Greg remained on the couch, still chuckling softly to himself, as Karen whirled around in a fury. "Oh, you think this is funny?" She snapped at him. Greg merely shrugged and said, "It's a little funny, Karen." Her fists clenched tightly as she vowed, "This isn't over. I will fix this. I will rebuild my reputation." But Greg cut her off, his voice calm yet final. You don't get it, do you? You're done. The neighborhood isn't scared of you anymore. The HOA board wants nothing to do with you, and the city just slapped you with a violation." As Greg rose to leave, still grinning, Karen was left alone with the bitter taste of defeat, unaware that her worst was yet to come. The next morning, with a stubborn spark of determination, Karen donned her most professional blazer and clutched her newly revised HOA violation handbook. She marched toward the community center, desperate to reclaim the authority she once wielded so effortlessly. But as soon as she stepped inside, an unmistakable shift in the room's energy halted all conversation. Whispers filled the air, and even Tom's smug grin in the front row reminded her that her reign had come crashing down. Clearing her throat, Karen prepared to address the room, unaware that every word would only further cement her downfall. Karen's mind refused to quiet. The last 24 hours replayed relentlessly in her thoughts like a feverish, unyielding nightmare. Images of FBI agents swarming her property, the chaotic tow truck disaster, the humiliating debacle at the HOA meeting, and, most piercing of all, the sound of neighbors laughing at her, churned over and over. For years she had ruled Maple Grove with an iron fist, doling out petty violations and wielding her clipboard like a scepter of absolute authority. Yet in one disastrous day that empire of control had crumbled into dust. Stunned, Karen exhaled a long, shaky breath and tried to compose herself. Okay, I can fix this," she murmured, determination battling despair in her eyes. She reached instinctively for her clipboard, the very tool that had symbolized her dominion, only to discover it was missing. A sinking feeling gripped her as the memory returned. Amidst the frenzy when the FBI had descended, she had dropped it in the street. There it lay, forgotten in the damp grass, an abandoned relic of a fallen empire, a stark emblem of her lost power. Just then, Greg's familiar voice intruded from behind the closed door of their living room. "You going to sit there all day, or are you coming outside?" he teased, his tone light despite the gravity of the situation. Karen glared at him, her pride bruised. "Why would I want to go outside?" she snapped, though the defiant spark in her eyes betrayed a longing to confront the world head-on, even if it meant facing further humiliation. Greg only smirked. "Oh, I don't know. I thought you might want to see the new sign," he replied, his words laced with mischief. "What sign?" Karen asked, her voice a mixture of suspicion and dread. With a knowing chuckle, Greg led her out into the cool evening air, and there, standing boldly at the entrance to the neighborhood, was a handmade wooden sign. Painted in bright, defiant colors, the sign's bold letters declared, "Welcome to Maple Grove, now 100% HOA free." The sight was a public proclamation of her downfall, a triumph of community spirit over her despotic rule. For a moment, Karen's entire body stiffened, as if frozen in time. The sight of that sign was the final searing blow. Greg's laughter rang out as he leaned against the porch railing, while neighbors milled about, some snapping pictures, others cheering and exchanging high-fives. A few even carried a cake adorned with the mocking inscription, "Ding Dong, the Karen's gone." The laughter, the celebration, it was all too much. Karen's world, which she had meticulously controlled for so long, was now unraveling before her eyes. What is happening?" she managed to stutter, her voice trembling with a mixture of fury and disbelief. Tom, one of the neighbors who had suffered under her harsh enforcement of arbitrary rules, stepped forward. With arms crossed and a smirk of incredulity, he said, "So let me get this straight. After all your bluster and all those ridiculous 911 calls, the only violation you ended up with was on your own property." His words stung, slicing through the remnants of her defiance. For a long, painful moment, Karen's mouth opened as if to protest, but no sound emerged. The realization was crushing. She had lost not only her authority, but also the respect and fear she had once commanded. The HOA board had turned its back on her. The FBI had publicly humiliated her. And now the entire neighborhood was reveling in her public undoing. Overwhelmed by the enormity of her fall from grace, Karen turned on her heel and stormed back into the house, slamming the door behind her. But the jubilant celebration outside continued unabated, a vivid reminder that her reign was over. Later that evening, the taste of defeat still fresh, Greg ambled into the kitchen with a self-satisfied grin. "So, Karen, did you enjoy the party?" he asked casually, his tone mocking, yet tinged with the satisfaction of long-awaited retribution. Karen shot him a death glare, her eyes blazing with indignation. "You let them do that, didn't you?" she hissed. Greg merely shrugged, replying with a light-hearted, "Hey, I'm just enjoying democracy in action." Not content with his verbal jabs, Greg produced his phone and with a triumphant smirk pressed play on a video. On the screen, Karen's earlier meltdown played out in excruciating detail. Her shrill screams at the FBI, her frantic stammered excuses, the raw panic in her eyes. "Delete that," she pleaded desperately, her voice breaking. Greg grinned even wider. "Oh, I can't. It's already been shared 1,000 times, he said, and Karen's anguished scream filled the room, a final despairing note in her long-fated ballad of hubris. As if fate were not yet finished with her, a sharp knock at the door startled Karen. She stiffened, her heart pounding with dread. Slowly, she turned toward Greg. "Tell me that's not the city inspector," she whispered, the horror in her voice unmistakable. Greg, taking a slow sip of his coffee, replied with a bemused smile, "That's the city inspector." In a moment of panic, Karen's eyes widened as she recalled the long-standing issues with her property. The inspector, with a matter-of-fact tone, handed her a formal notice. "Ma'am, your fence is 3 inches over the city's legal height limit. You have 48 hours to bring it into compliance, or you'll face a fine of $500 per day." The finality of the words was crushing. Unlike her fabricated HOA violations, this was a real binding code violation, another nail in the coffin of her authority. Karen stood frozen, feeling as though her very soul was leaving her body. Greg, meanwhile, basked in the poetic justice of it all. "Looks like you finally get to experience what it's like to be on the receiving end of a violation," he mused, his tone dripping with ironic satisfaction. In that moment, as she snatched the notice and slammed the door shut, Karen could no longer deny the truth. The community had reclaimed its dignity, and she, once the self-proclaimed queen of Maple Grove, had become nothing more than a cautionary tale. Greg, after a moment of quiet triumph, stepped out onto the porch, taking a deep breath as he savored the newfound calm. A peace that had eluded the neighborhood for years. For the first time in what seemed like an eternity, the residents of Maple Grove were free from the tyranny of Karen's rule. In that bittersweet, rain-soaked night, it was clear that her downfall was complete. The very fabric of the community had woven a collective judgment against her, and her empire of fear had crumbled under the weight of justice and common decency. And so the legend of Karen's downfall was cemented in local lore, a wild, unforgettable saga of power, hubris, and poetic retribution. The story of how one overbearing enforcer lost everything in a single catastrophic day would be recounted with laughter and incredulity for years to come. As the night settled into an uneasy calm, one thing was undeniable. In Maple Grove, no one would ever again tolerate a dictatorship born from petty violations and unchecked arrogance. In today's society, Karen's story serves as a powerful reminder. Leadership is not about dominating others with arbitrary rules, but about serving your community with humility and accountability. When we let ego and overreach guide us, we risk not only alienating those around us, but also undermining the very foundations of trust and respect. In American society, it's essential to listen to diverse perspectives, follow fair rules, and admit mistakes when they occur. Ask yourself, are you fostering a positive environment, or are you inadvertently pushing people away with rigid control? Are you open to constructive criticism, and do you value the input of your neighbors and colleagues? Let's build communities where empathy, collaboration, and transparency lead the way. If you found this advice helpful, please subscribe to our channel for more insights and share your thoughts below. How do you promote positive leadership in your community?